Bungalow Bill here. Today, I'm going to be taking a look at the Empyrean. This is a video I have attempted to do before, but the Empyrean is a very complicated ship, so I'm trying to do it again. What I feel really makes this ship different from a lot of other campaign craft is that it doesn't really seem to make any compromises for the neater campaign. It's hard to find a place where I look at this ship and I say, this was probably a concession that was made to make this work in the campaign. So first, let's take a high-level overview of the ship systems, then a low-level overview of the ship systems, and then we'll do some actual combat testing to demonstrate the ship. As a basic high-level overview, the ship costs just slightly north of 1.6 million materials, and as a result, I have never seen this in the neater campaign before, and I probably will never. With a block count of 23,000, I find this is quite a bit higher than other comparable campaign ships, and as we go into the more low-level overview, we will see why that is the case. And it's high even compared to my own ships of similar cost. The firepower is fairly moderate at about 1,000, and that's because some of the weapons in this ship either favor reliability over firepower, or they are simply slightly undervalued in terms of firepower. A moderate top speed of almost 50 meters per second means that if you're fighting her with a ship, she will probably choose the range and not your ship. And this is a thing to be careful of because the range that she chooses is quite long. When looking at her, the first thing that is apparent is there are a lot of railguns. None of these railguns are particularly large in themselves, but they are highly redundant because of their number. Similarly, as you look over the ship, the Sea Whiz is fairly broken up, and the missile systems are fairly scattered throughout, along with propulsion basically everywhere. Unlike a lot of other large ships in neater, which are fairly concentrated with one large gun or a few huge missiles, the Empyrean really requires damage everywhere to take her systems offline. There are very few places in which one large critical hit will cause her systems to entirely fail. Defensively, she is carrying some amount of Sea Whiz, a large quantity of missile interceptors, a moderately powerful LAMS, although this 11,000 power could be a hair weak, but the energy available is reasonably high. I do find that at this cost, I usually go a bit higher than this. The SACMAT is almost 50% more powerful in terms of actual pumping energy. And then, you cannot see them now, but she does have shields. Now, in terms of combat characteristics for how she fights overall, the combat distance is 1,750 meters, and the minimum approach angle is 30 degrees. This minimum approach angle is the angle that she makes from being completely away or completely towards you. That means that she'll approach or depart at an angle about like this. And if you are faster than her, she will always be at this angle to you. So if you use AP railguns or that sort of thing, you do have to be warned that you are going to be losing a substantial amount of damage to this angle, and you will have to penetrate a substantial amount of additional armor, unless she is at her full combat range of 1,750 meters. Now, let's look in terms of construction. So, the first thing to notice is I will minimize the blocks, and this is pretty chunky for armor, right? It's not super consistent everywhere, but we have heavy armor. In this case, there's a single block here. It's like that in a few places, but the block count isn't massively inflated that way. And then a slope plus an air gap, which is a little weird. Like, right, there's a little bit of weird stuff going on here, but in general, she does have air gaps, but no spall liner. And she's also not using, for example, if she's using the heavy armor as the spall liner, she'd be a bit better against Hesh than she is. But still, this is a lot of armor, air gap, armor, air gap. etc. And it's highly effective against heat. And although it is less effective against Hesh because of the lack of spell liner, the fact that she has lambs plus shields, plus she bobs up and down, plus she likes to fight at 1750 meters, and Hesh shells do not benefit from high speed, it makes her hard to damage with Hesh compared to heat, which you can put on missiles. So Hesh defense not as important, but if you make a ship that brawls at close range and can keep up with her, Hesh is a viable shell to get past this armor. Now, there are surge protectors. So, I believe she was put in before the changes where heavy armor doesn't soak EMP anymore. Her surge protectors do give her a little bit of game. A little bit of game against EMP. And she has remote guided missiles, so there's a lot of GPP spread out through here. And it's in here in a lot of places. So you can kind of see a bunch of places highlighting for just this one card. Despite the fact that it's not incredibly well protected from EMP, it is hard to knock all of it out. Now, I did mention that she has a lot of blocks. And there's stuff like this. It's not in a bunch of places, but with these material storage containers, at the very least, the 2x2 units could be used. Most likely room for the 4x4s could be found. But with a ship this large, the full-size material storage containers, there should be a place for these. And these are way more efficient, both in terms of block count and in terms of volume. So, don't really know why she doesn't use these. So, I will get to the energy systems and that sort of stuff later. But she uses mimics. To me, she kind of looks like a fan build that was got to a really high level and then gotten campaign ready and put into the campaign and potentially built over a very long period of time. If you're to do this now and really slate it for the campaign, I would imagine you'd want to use decos to keep the block count down for a better performance. It's also interesting that these are shell clips used as windows. And it's like that in a few places. This craft has a lot of mimics on it instead of decos. I would probably attribute that to us being that she was just built a very long time ago. Also, stuff like these crates should be decos. These things are actually ammo. These things are actually ammo parts box. Concepts and unfinished business. So, a lot of ships have a room like this, and although a little bit strange, I think it's a good thing for the creators to have fun with their vehicles. There's also another one in here. Well, yes, actually I did think there'd be something in here. Alright, let's look at her power. So, I'm going to do this the way that I often do. So I could just go through her systems. I'm probably going to have to hold her in place so that she doesn't fall out of the sky when I do this. Although she is mostly held up by custom jet engines, so that might not happen. But I'm going to make sure that her engines are fully loaded so that we can get a very good idea about how they work. The other thing is that she does use steam turbines, which means that I need to drain her batteries too. This is probably a slight overkill, but I don't actually know. Oh, it's not. She has fantastically strong steam turbines. I really need to get this going until the battery juice actually goes down. However long this takes is however long this takes. She has a lot of railguns, and I could have her shoot at something, but this is the way I'm going about it instead. Gives a really good idea about what she's actually capable of. Okay, it looks like we finally maxed out her energy generation capacity. So this steam engine is sort of at the heart of her energy generation capabilities. So let's take a look at the block stats. Power per material burned, 526. Energy per volume, 119. So this is just the stats that you expect of the high-quality small steam turbine, or small steam engine. These used to be better, but this is just how they are now. They got nerfed slightly to give small, medium, and large all of their own issues, which probably annoyed some people, but I think was kind of necessary. There's quite a lot of that. This should have the same stats. Yep, same stats. So, massive amount of engine power coming from these. She also has turbines. So this is something that I did not know that you could do. Hook the turbine generator up to 2 at the same time to save on a little bit of volume. These are very short. So energy per volume, reasonably high for turbines at 78, but this energy per material burned is low. So this is kind of just worse than the steam engine, except these are much smaller. If you put one hole through like any part of a lot of this, it'll cripple a significant portion of this engine. If you put a hole through these guys, it won't damage the other ones. Now, let me look. She does have small steam turbines somewhere. I should probably do this so that I can actually find them. Oh, I did also mean to bring these up at some point, although I'm not really getting to them now. She does have, I believe these are internal intakes. Yeah, she does have internal intakes. But not internal exhausts. I guess that was just the line of cheesiness that was acceptable. Also smoke. I should point out smoke. And this is quite strong smoke. I do not suggest trying to kill her with lasers. So, right, small steam turbine generators as well. So now this is getting under half the energy per volume of the steam engine. Much higher energy per material burned. This is sort of where I start to justify using these instead. But really, if you ask me why I use steam turbines, I use them because it's really easy to throw a bunch of them down. And they're very separated from each other. It's the same thing with missiles, that if you put a hole through this one, it doesn't affect this one. And we can see shields here. So, big shield, big effect strength. This will drain a lot of energy, but it does make her quite challenging to hit with shells compared to what she could be otherwise. And the next thing I want to talk about is what keeps her airborne. And primarily, it's enormous custom jet engines. Although she weighs a bit more than she used to. I did just hit shift, and she is still flying. Just to show how redundant and overkill her thrust is. The only way that I've ever knocked the Empyrean out of the sky is by either getting her to hit her scuttle settings, where she started to despawn and fall out of the sky, or by AI deading her, which is possible to do. Her AI coverage is a bit thin for a ship like this because with the right shell, you can either put it all the way through with a lucky shot and AI dead her, or with an EMP strike. That is also a viable way to kill her. And she does not have redundant movement cards on other AIs. So if you kill this AI, that's it, the fight's over. So in addition to these absolutely massive custom jet engines, which are actually a little bit interesting, okay, well, I might have lied. These are actually just massive stacks of combustors. That really does help lift a huge block of heavy armor like that. And all things considered, probably not necessary to have massively efficient lift. And then there's a couple jet engines scattered around. I'm not sure they're super important. The ones for turning are, but the ones for lift are probably not the most important things in the world. Now let's look at our railguns. Although these do sort of seem to be the important portion of her, I do think that at heart she's sort of a missile cruiser. So it's a little bit hard to tell from here, but this is a 2-clip Tetris. And these are 2-meter autoloaders using a pure rail draw supercavitation based shell. So personally, I like to at least have just enough gunpowder so that if I make all of these into coolers instead, they're just barely all utilized. I find that gives me the best firepower per cost ratio, but doing it this way means that these shells are completely non-reactive. They don't need to be ammo ejected, and they can soak up a lot of damage. Usually with railguns, because of how much space you use up with chargers and that sort of thing, I like to use a 4-clip Tetris. It's pretty easy to do a 4-clip Tetris with railguns for the most part. However, these chargers are so expensive that the efficiency loss from doing a 2-clip Tetris is not huge. So I can see that as sort of a justification. I also prefer to keep turret necks a bit smaller than this. It makes them easier to arm. Having a fat turret neck compared to the turret cap tends to make it a bit easy for high explosive to leak in unless you're really careful. So we'll go on to the gun itself, and I strongly suggest to not do this. So right here, there is no armor on the neck. Draba did say that there were some fixes for the sub-object grid casting for explosive damage. What that means is that high explosive damage is propagated in the parent space, so relative to the coordinates of the entire vehicle, and the blocks from the sub-object are projected into that space, and that can't be done perfectly, so there are errors, and that tends to lead to things happening like you to take a high explosive shell to the deck here, and for it to not see these blocks as meeting these blocks, and for it to sneak through and just chop the neck off of a turret. The Empyrean seems to not suffer from that badly, and I think it's because of how she's shaped. It makes it highly unlikely that shells hit the deck unless you have vehicles that are very close to her at a very high or low altitude. But this is still something to be careful of. And in certain fights, I don't have ships that can take advantage of this, but this could be highly disadvantageous to the Empyrean in certain battles. So, if you take a look at the shell, reasonably standard. The armor pierce is set up so that it does exactly full damage to stacked heavy armor. So the tooltip for supercavitation base says it removes the slowdown incurred by water. I don't believe this is what the tooltip used to be. I believe the tooltip used to say it incurs 90% of the slowdown incurred by water. I don't know if my memory is faulty, if the mechanic changed or not. However, in my test against the Black Current, and the Black Current likes to sit just above the seafloor, once the Empyrean had retreated to her 1750 meter limit that she likes to fight at, the shells were slowing down too much in the water to actually hit the Black Current anymore, and on the rare occasions that they did make contact, they didn't do any real damage. So I suspect that there is still some slowdown, but I don't actually know. And then we have two different shells, and they're both kinetic, and these two different shells are used by the Sea-Whiz guns, because there are two different types of Sea-Whiz guns here. Yeah, I was asking a little bit too much of her to keep flying there, I guess. So we have these broadsiders. These are very weak belt feds. Firepower 0.2, sustained 0.14. And this one's quite a bit stronger. A sustained 16.69. The autoloader and ammo intake limits are not matching here, so there's an error somewhere in that gun construction. It's not the only Grey Talon ship that's like that. I noticed recently the Smog has an error as well, and in that case, I don't know if it's intentional. For the Empyrean, definitely not intentional. All right, let's make an attempt to find all of the missiles on this craft. So I've taken multiple looks at her before, and I almost always miss missiles when I look over her. Let's knock some of these off for my sanity. Excellent. So there are a variety of missiles with a variety of purposes. Some of them I don't necessarily understand. I do not understand why there's an APN guidance between the frag heads on this missile. However, APN guidance missile, not super maneuverable. However, her missiles are remote guided, so you have to either avoid these or hard kill them. You can't use flares. And for the most part, despite the slight nerf, making remote guided missiles have a base inaccuracy, which here it says remote guidance max error 3 meters. I still think that remote guidance missiles are better than every other type of missile. And the exception would be if you're trying to hit an exceptionally small and erratic target. However, I'm not sure that APN guidance is quite right with the gain calculations. So it's possible for a very unmaneuverable missile like this that you want to turn the gain up. We are actually going to take a look at that behavior later when we do the practical testing. Although I won't be comparing it to missiles with a different gain or missiles that are more agile. This one, fairly similar, except high thrust output, kinetic missile. These make it substantially harder to kill her missiles than they would otherwise because these soak up a lot of damage. And kinetic missiles are one of my favorite munitions in From the Depths if I'm actually trying to make a very good vehicle because they are quite hard to counter. I'm going to get rid of her armor because I'm having so much trouble finding the other missiles. There are, I believe, 3 more pods that I haven't found yet. So there are these. These are substantially more agile for a huge missile than they normally would be due to the turning thruster at the nose and the double fins. These are also prediction guidance, whereas the other ones are APN guidance. And these allow them to hit very fast-moving vehicles that do not have a high rate of turn. We will see that. I'm going to put these against the vehicle that dodges most of the APN guidance, but gets hit by the target prediction guidance. But we'll see how we can take advantage of the characteristics of her missiles to make it much harder to die to the Empyrean. The thumper head, increased velocity and increased health, and frag's just always good. And then here with medium missiles, fairly agile, prediction guidance, a lot of frag warheads, and even a signal processor. Although these ones need it because they're actually using the active radar seekers instead of remote guidance. I believe they are the only missile on the entire ship that's like this. And if memory serves, I'm missing one more missile somewhere that is not one of the sonar buoys. She does have sonar buoys, so you can't... here it is. This is what I was looking for. For some reason, I thought it was somewhere else. And shape charge head, APN guidance, remote guidance. So she has a lot of bases covered. And I did briefly show this off before, but despite the fact that this doesn't really seem like the most anti-missile defense, it is incredibly hard to kill the Empyrean with missiles. Or it is incredibly hard to kill her with huge missiles. I have a submarine missile cruiser that costs a little over 1.1 million materials. It can't do it. And the Black Current can't do it either. They just don't land any shots. The Black Current against the Empyrean is a stalemate. They don't damage each other at all. Okay, I'm going to do some combat demonstrations now to show how the Empyrean actually fights. And something I should say is that I spent a long time trying to piece together fleets from the AI that cost equal to or less than the Empyrean and beat her. It is incredibly hard to do. Unless you're willing to use nukes. And one of the reasons is because the Empyrean herself spawns nukes back here, and not many vehicles actually target them properly. But assuming that you give help to the AI fleets with your own interceptors that take out the nukes, it's at least possible. But I'm going to use my own vehicles to demonstrate, which means that I'm going to move the Empyrean to the enemy team. So here we have the Sekhmet, which I have on the Steam Workshop. It's an airship that I made a long time ago. It's a front-sider. It's made to be just incredibly meta and just kill big, neater vehicles. It costs about 100,000 less than the Empyrean, and the firepower is actually substantially less. And a lot of that is because, despite the fact that she looks like she's an APS vehicle and not a missile vehicle, she's a missile cruiser. She uses Thumper missiles that do incredible amounts of damage and are highly underrated. This just also is kind of a vulnerable gun. So this gets taken out pretty early, and these missiles that are hidden all the way in the back just keep fighting and fighting and fighting until she falls into the water at like 58% health and dies. And these contribute to the firepower, but they're CWIS, so don't spend a lot of time fighting. Now, she fights at a closer distance than the Empyrean, and the Empyrean is faster than her. And this means that we will be chasing the Empyrean the entire fight. And the reason that's important is because we're using kinetic missiles. So since our kinetic missiles will be chasing the target, they will be seeing the Empyrean move at a much slower velocity, than she actually is for the closing speed, and will do less damage. And the Empyrean will have more time to shoot down the missiles than we have. I am going to have to do some work to make my ability to shoot down missiles much better. I don't choose very good targets with my interceptors, and that's because I built the Sekhmet before some of the work was done that lets you choose targets more intelligently. So we're going to watch the Empyrean turn tail. So we'll get a few good volleys on her before she starts running, but she's going to start running at a very sharp angle to us. And the Empyrean bobs up and down, and this makes her hard to hit with even fairly fast shells. I will give some examples of that, of what makes certain types of weapons less effective against her than they might otherwise be. For example, frag crams with inertial fuses, because they'll ignore her shields, they could absolutely shred her, but you need to shoot them out of a vehicle that's faster than the Empyrean so you can catch her. Even some moderately fast APS shells can have difficulty hitting the Empyrean. Right, so here come my kinetic missiles, and they're running out of fuel too early because they're chasing the Empyrean and she's running away. They do substantially less damage than they could. They could do double that amount of damage. So I'm going to take my combat distance, and I'm just going to set it slightly higher than the Empyrean's. Another thing I could do is set it way lower than it is right now so that I get right up next to her, and then my missiles will make it there easily. But I'm going to set the Sekhmet to back off. So now the Empyrean is going to start to turn around and fight me. I think the Sekhmet's probably already lost a fair bit of railgun firepower. It tends to not last that long. Although, she is winning, and this is a demonstration of one way you can beat the Empyrean, is to simply just use a giant front-sider. Or even just the Empyrean without hedges, because the Empyrean does kind of hedge a lot against many different vehicles. You can see my short-range damage dealers working there. My missiles are still coming up a little bit short because the Empyrean hasn't really closed yet, and I backed off myself. Still getting some decent work in with the heat, though. The next barrage should do a bit better, because the Empyrean is going to start coming towards me instead of the other way around. However, if the Sekhmet didn't have those lasers to take the nukes out, she wouldn't win this fight. It's kind of the problem in trying to kill the Empyrean with faction craft, is that the Scarlet Dawn craft that you might fight her with if you just want to fight her with one big vehicle, that sort of thing, they just get nuked. Actually, nuking the Empyrean herself, fantastic. I think I haven't backed up enough. The Empyrean should run... If I back up a little bit more, I believe the Empyrean will run at a much tighter angle to me. Okie dokie. Let's back off just a little bit more. God, those menus confuse me so much sometimes. Okay, this should force the Empyrean to actually start turning towards me decently. So this should form a slightly stronger angle towards me. And actually, even my missiles, depending on where I hit or what happens while she's bobbing, can be a little bit hard to hit with. So she basically dodged an entire missile volley just by bouncing. The missiles coming at her are not super agile. Can definitely run into some issues sometimes, but most of them wind up getting her eventually. Okay, now she's approaching the way I wanted her to. Now we're going to have much better luck hitting her with missiles. The Sekhmet does shoot out two different types of missiles, which is a little bit unfortunate because they don't necessarily sync up that well with each other. The huge missiles have a much slower reload than the large missiles do. They're still running out of juice a little bit, but now you see that's a massive amount of thump damage. Right? If we were hitting her like that this entire fight, it would already be over. So we're still winning despite the fact that my main armaments were doing almost nothing. But if I fought at a slightly different range, we'd absolutely eviscerate the Empyrean, because I'd be backing off quickly and she'd be approaching quickly, and it just makes such a massive difference in these missile fights. So the air gap plus the heavy armor as the innermost layer is still giving us a bit of trouble. But starting to get those huge missiles in now is just really giving the Empyrean a bad day. And it's already, this will drag on for a little bit longer, but it's already clear how this is going. So I'm going to set up another fleet and sort of demonstrate some ways to get past the Empyrean's defenses. Okay, so I just spawned in a fleet that is just a little bit less expensive than the Empyrean. And this is the kind of fleet composition that I often like to have when I'm taking down a large craft, or even just fighting anything in general, although there are some gaps in this fleet composition. It can't shoot at submarines at all. But there are basically 3 vehicles. I have 6 of the sailfish, which are on the Steam Workshop. I will unpause for just a small amount of time, which will let everything load. And they use one of my favorites, the EMP Heat Warhead with a reinforced body to give it a little bit of extra health. They're in fairly small pods, so they don't get staggered well. They would work a fair bit better if they were staggered more. We're not getting our barrels spawning in, but we also do have Sea-Wiz, which will give us a little bit more missile defense, chip in a little bit of extra damage. And each sailfish does contribute a little bit in terms of hard kill countermeasures to help the main vehicle in the fleet, the Kobold that I featured in one of my videos, which is the same as the normal Kobold, except it shoots armor-piercing shells instead, and is just a little bit more expensive. It just has some more rail chargers and that sort of stuff. But otherwise is exactly the same as the normal Kobold. And to prevent us from getting nuked, I spawned in a few Thunder Shocks. The Empyrean will shoot at targets of opportunity occasionally when its guns cannot target the Kobold. So our Thunder Shocks are going to take damage, but they're not going to damage the Empyrean in turn. They just need to be around long enough to kill the ICBMs. So let's spawn in the Empyrean. And basically the deal here is that we just spam out a bunch of missiles that'll overwhelm the Empyrean's missile defenses. And then we have one massive vehicle. I say massive, it's less than half the cost of the Empyrean, but one large vehicle that tanks the Empyrean's damage. Will the other vehicles actually kill her? That's not to say that this Kobold's shells don't hurt, but they're not that important. They're going to lose a lot of damage from the shields and from the angle that the Empyrean will eventually push herself at. Also, I would highly recommend, if you are going to kill her with a fleet like this, to spam one type of weapon. All missiles is a good way to do it, because once you've saturated the Empyrean's missile defenses, each additional missile is just good, right? It's basically not getting affected by missile defenses at all. Similarly, if you're using APS, just spam APS. Once you saturated her lambs is useless. And if you're using disruptors, you'll just render her almost defenseless against APS as long as you get close enough. So we're still losing a lot of missiles, but we're getting a lot through as well. And in particular, a lot of EMP damage. I think, yep, the Empyrean's going down. So despite all of those surge protectors, with the EMP changes, a block of heavy armor like this can only do so much. I don't know if there will be other EMP changes at some point, but this is just what happens. And this, you could make a fleet like this that wins without EMP. If I did this using the same cost of Dandelions instead, it would still win. It just takes a lot longer. So the Kobold tanked that pretty well. It's at 94%. It has pretty good missile defenses, especially with all of these other vehicles that have interceptors on them. It has a dense network of shields and a small frontal area with a lot of wedges to help it against the kinetic damage. And then there are the Thunder Shocks to make sure that she doesn't get nuked. So I'm going to destroy the enemy vehicles, get rid of the Kobold, and show off another thing that you can do to defend yourself a little bit against the Empyrean. Alright, I have a very high suspicion that we're going to run over some of our own vehicles during this test, but that's the sacrifice I'm willing to make. Let's spot in the Empyrean again, and demonstrate this test. So I want to follow this craft, and this is the Bastet, sort of a water skimmer that I don't find highly effective. It would be much better in the circumstance if it had shields, and there's no reason it can't have shields. I do think that with the custom rudder changes, I am going to try some changes to the Bastet, because her big failing is that she's simply not maneuverable enough. She is, however, still fairly fast, at over 150 meters per second. And her primary job here is to not die. When you sort of build a fleet like this, you have one big ship, and I like them to be fairly defensive and tanky. Their whole role here is to allow the smaller ships to chip away at the enemy vehicle. The Bastet being half the cost of the Empyrean isn't really intended to kill the Empyrean on its own, although if you do have it programmed well enough, and it is dodgy enough, it is probably quite possible. Her Seawas probably shouldn't be wasting shots on the Empyrean, but it really has no way to know that there should be missiles that should be shooting it instead, and the whole reason I like Seawas is because it can shoot down missiles. So we retreated to a range where the Empyrean really couldn't hurt us. The Bastet could just stay at that range. It's not doing that. it's supposed to switch broadsides, and that causes it to do this sort of thing. Still, the EMP missile or the APN guidance missiles have a bit of a hard time hitting her. The reason for that is that they don't lead the target enough, and I believe that is because their gain is a little bit too low. She should be getting hit by them. Perhaps I should have used something other than the sailfishes, because I think the Empyrean is going to go down before I actually get what I wanted out of this test. But I think the point can still be made to some extent that speed is still highly beneficial against the Empyrean. However, you can see these target prioritization or target prediction guidance missiles coming in. These are aiming at the intercept point, and these can hit you regardless of your speed. And some of the huge missiles and large missiles on the Empyrean are also like that. So against those, the way to dodge them is to move the intercept point very quickly. And the only way to do that is just to be able to turn better. Right now we're getting hit just a little bit by the APN guidance missiles, but they do depend on how we're approaching / retreating from the Empyrean. They have a fairly substantial miss rate. For a ship like this, the target prediction guidance are far superior, just because the APN guidance trail the intercept point by too much. You can see them trying a little bit, but they're steering in way too late. They either need to be faster to hit a target like this, or they need a higher gain so that they don't trail the intercept point by quite as much. They're simply not reacting to the line of sight changes quickly enough, which is the way APN guidance works, and the way that you can identify them is that they turn in response to a change in where the enemy appears that it is compared to the missile. And rather than just trying to steer towards the target, or rather than trying to steer towards the intercept point. And I think even some of the more agile APN guidance missiles here may have a little bit too low of a gain that way, because they don't respond to the line of sight changes fast enough, even when I don't believe their output is saturated. I should definitely stagger those missiles a little bit more. We're losing way too many of them. However, the Bastet is tanking this pretty phenomenally, in my opinion. We've made it for quite a long time, and even without shields, the Bastet has done a fairly moderate job of tanking a 1.6 million material craft, just by being fast enough that it's not taking the missiles that well. I think if you actually want to make a vehicle that's really high resilient to the Empyrean, and you're doing it with a water skimmer like this, you would use custom rudders under here, and you could make her turn way faster. I'm going to experiment with that, but at some point in the future, as well as probably mostly relying on custom rudders to give the Bastet lift instead of hydrofoils. Hydrofoils at the moment are actually really overpowered. In the patch notes that I read, I thought that they were making my craft maybe a hair slower. They were actually making them faster. The sign of the drag is reversed on hydrofoils on the alpha test branch right now. So they make your craft faster instead of slower. It's just a nocebo effect, really. I'm going to take a quick look to see how the Empyrean's been weathering the storm. Probably not that well. When I was making my first attempt at this video, it was before the current 3.4.4 set of beta/alpha test changes, and ramming the Empyrean was incredibly successful. I haven't built another viable ramming vehicle since then, but it's probably still incredibly successful. The Empyrean is not very good at keeping craft off of her, because she's not that quick for her size. And her CWIS isn't that strong, so she doesn't really shut down craft that quickly. I think we AI deaded the main AI. Yeah, we did. but we'd already taken the Empyrean to very nearly the low health despawn point anyway. I think she scuttles way earlier than she should for low health. The Imperial will keep fighting, I think way lower than her scuttle settings allow her to. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope to see you in the future.